She wore a white uniform. She smiled at the sick. She held their hands. She whispered comfort to women who were terrified and alone in the darkest place on earth. And then she poisoned them. Not once, not in a moment of panic, not under direct orders with a gun to her head. She did it calmly, repeatedly, methodically. The way a professional shows up to work and does their job without thinking twice. Her name was Vera Salvequart. And by the time Allied forces uncovered what she had done inside Ravensbrück concentration camp, even the most battle-hardened investigators had to step outside and breathe. Because this wasn't a story about a guard with a rifle. This wasn't a commander giving orders from behind a desk. This was a nurse, a woman trained to heal, a woman that dying prisoners asked for by name, because they believed she was the one person in that nightmare who actually cared whether they lived or died. They were wrong, and that betrayal, that specific, intimate, personal betrayal of trust, is what separates Vera Salvequart from almost every other figure to emerge from the darkest chapter in modern history. World War II gave the world no shortage of monsters. Generals who signed death warrants over breakfast. Camp commandants who went home to their families at night, SS doctors who conducted experiments on living human beings and then filed paperwork about it afterward. But Vera Salvequart didn't fit any of those categories cleanly. She operated in the shadows between them, in the gray, suffocating space where victims came to her voluntarily, where they thanked her, where they felt, in their final hours, that at least one person in that place gave a damn about their survival. Ravensbrück concentration camp was the only major Nazi camp built specifically for women. Between 1939 and 1945, over 130,000 women passed through its gates. Polish resistance fighters, Soviet prisoners, Jewish women, Roma women, political activists, women who had simply loved the wrong person or said the wrong thing in the wrong room at the wrong time. Tens of thousands of them never came home. Inside Ravensbrück, there was a sick bay, the Revier, the one place in the entire camp that was supposed to represent something close to mercy, where ill prisoners could receive medical attention instead of being worked or beaten to death on the factory floor. Vera Salvequart worked there. And what she did inside those walls, using nothing more than a small white powder and the trust of desperate women, shook the post-war tribunals to their core. If you just found this channel, you're in the right place. X-History doesn't water things down. We don't skip the uncomfortable parts. We go straight into the real stories, the ones that reveal something true and difficult and important about what human beings are actually capable of. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because this channel goes where most history channels won't. Now let's go back to the beginning, because Vera Salvequart was not born a monster. And honestly, that makes everything about this story so much harder to process. She was born in 1919 in Czechoslovakia, a region already fracturing under the weight of shifting borders, dying empires, and a Europe that couldn't stop remaking itself through violence. Her early life is deliberately difficult to trace, and that's not an accident. Throughout her trial, Vera gave contradictory accounts of her own background. Different dates, different details, different versions of the same story depending on who was asking and what she needed them to believe. That tells you something important about her. Before we even get to Ravensbrück, Vera Salvequart understood from early on that narrative was power. That controlling what people believed about you was a form of survival, maybe even a form of control. At some point, the exact timeline is unclear, she received basic medical or nursing training, enough to appear credible, enough to be handed a white uniform and placed in a position of care over vulnerable women. In the chaos of wartime Europe, appearing trustworthy was often enough. By the early 1940s, she had found her way into the Nazi camp system, not as a prisoner, as someone on the other side of the door. And inside Ravensbrück, where death was so routine it had become invisible, Vera Salvequart found exactly the cover she needed to do what she was about to do. The sick bay at Ravensbrück was called the Revier, In theory, it was where ill prisoners received care. In reality, it was understaffed, undersupplied, and overwhelmed from the moment it opened. Women arrived with typhus, tuberculosis, infected wounds from experiments, and bodies broken down to almost nothing by starvation and forced labor. But despite everything, despite knowing that medical care inside a concentration camp was never truly about saving lives, women wanted to get into the revier, because at least inside those walls, you weren't on the factory floor. You weren't standing in freezing roll calls at 4 a.m. You weren't being screamed at and beaten for moving too slowly. You were lying down, and someone was supposed to be taking care of you. That hope, that desperate, completely human need to believe that someone cared, was exactly what Vera Salvequart exploited. At some point during her time in the revier, Vera began administering a white powder to selected patients. She told them it was medicine. She told them it would help with pain, help them sleep, help them recover faster. Some women asked for it, because inside Ravensbrück, anything that promised even temporary relief from suffering felt like an act of grace. They trusted her completely, without hesitation. The powder was not medicine. Prosecutors and historians who later examined the case believe it was almost certainly a lethal substance, likely phenol, or a similar compound that had been used elsewhere in the Nazi camp system, specifically for killing prisoners considered too sick to work or too weak to survive. Women who received it deteriorated rapidly. Within hours or days, they were gone, and Vera moved calmly to the next patient. Here is the detail that separates careless cruelty from something far more calculated and disturbing. Vera didn't poison randomly. She chose women who were already severely weakened, women with no connections or allies inside the camp, women who were isolated, the ones nobody would immediately notice missing, women who were, crucially, the most grateful to her. She selected with patience, with precision, the way someone selects who is worth the risk and who isn't. This was not a moment of madness. This was not blind obedience to orders. This was premeditated. And the question that genuinely haunted the judges at her post-war trial, the question that still doesn't have a clean, satisfying answer today, was the simplest one possible. Why? Was she acting under SS instruction? Was she performing some twisted version of mercy, ending lives she believed were already over? Was there something else entirely driving her? Something personal, something darker? The survivors who testified had their own answer, and when they finally stood up in that courtroom and spoke, the silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. May 1945. The war in Europe is over. Allied forces are moving through the rubble of the Third Reich, liberating camps, documenting atrocities, trying to make sense of a scale of human suffering that no language had ever been built to describe. And the women who walked out of Ravensbrück, the ones who survived the experiments, the starvation, the forced labor, the endless brutal machinery of that place, they started talking. Most of the world was focused on the big names, the commanders, the architects of the final solution, the men in the grand offices who designed the system from the top. But some survivors kept mentioning a name that wasn't a commander, wasn't a doctor, wasn't an SS officer with a rank and a title. They kept mentioning a nurse. They remembered her face, her voice, the way she smiled when she handed them medicine. The specific, particular horror of realizing only later, only after liberation, only when they compared stories with other women, that the person they had trusted most inside that camp had been killing them one by one. The testimonies were consistent, devastating, specific in ways that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. And British authorities arrested Vera Salvequart. The Ravensbrück trials began in 1946 under British military jurisdiction. Vera Salvequart stood in that courtroom and did exactly what she had always done. She performed. She presented herself as a victim, a woman trapped inside an evil system, doing what she could to survive, helping prisoners wherever possible, powerless against the machinery of the SS. She was calm, articulate, composed in a way that made some observers uncomfortable because it didn't look like innocence. It looked like practice. But the survivors kept coming. Woman after woman took the stand and described the same pattern. The white powder, the reassurance, the rapid deterioration, the death. Over and over the same sequence, the same smiling nurse at the center of it. One survivor described watching her closest friend in the camp, a woman she had protected and looked after for months, accept medicine from Vera and be dead within 2 days. She had grieved that death as illness, as the inevitable cruelty of Ravensbrück claiming one more life. It was only in that courtroom, hearing other women describe identical experiences, that the truth landed. Her friend hadn't died from illness. She had been murdered by the woman who promised to heal her. The courtroom didn't erupt, it went quiet. That silence was the verdict before the verdict. Vera Salvequart was found guilty of willful murder. She was sentenced to death. And here, right here, is the moment where history forces you to sit with something deeply uncomfortable. Because even at sentencing, even after everything that had been laid out in that courtroom with devastating clarity, there were those who questioned whether full justice was truly possible, whether any sentence handed down in a British military court in 1946 could account for the specific, intimate, personal nature of what she had done. These weren't battlefield deaths. These weren't victims of a system so large and impersonal that individual responsibility dissolved inside it. These were women who looked Vera Salvequart in the eye and said thank you, and she smiled back and let them die anyway. Vera Salvequart was executed by hanging on April 26, 1947. She was 27 years old. And in the seconds before it happened, according to accounts from those present, she was composed, almost eerily so. The same composure she had carried through the trial, through the testimony, through every moment where a person with genuine remorse would have broken down completely. Whether that composure was courage, or emptiness, or simply the continuation of a performance she had been giving her entire adult life, nobody could say for certain. What we know is this: she died quickly, cleanly, with far more dignity than she had afforded the women she poisoned slowly in the dark of the Revier. Vera Salvequart is not remembered the way Mengele is remembered. She doesn't have the same dark historical gravity as the commanders and architects of the Holocaust. But her story matters specifically because of that. Because she reminds us that evil doesn't always arrive in a uniform with a weapon. Sometimes it arrives in white. Sometimes it speaks softly. Sometimes it holds your hand while it kills you. The women of Ravensbrück survived impossible things. They endured experiments and starvation and violence that no human being should ever face. And some of them, in their most vulnerable moments, were betrayed by the one person in that entire nightmare they allowed themselves to trust. That betrayal deserves to be remembered. They deserve to be remembered. This has been X History. If this video meant something to you, share it. Because these stories don't just belong to history books. They belong to everyone willing to face the truth of what human beings have done to each other, and what we must never allow again. Subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.